Hello and welcome to everyone. For those of you who do not know me, I'm president of the Berks History Center and also vice president of Reformed Congregation Oheb Shalom. I must acknowledge Ben Neely for agreeing to my ideas and suggestions pertaining to the project of highlighting the Jewish population of Berks County, their accomplishments, contributions, and stories. The Sidney and Esther Bratt Holocaust program is the first in a series of ongoing events and exhibits. Berks History Center is proud to announce that all proceeds from today are going to the Edwin and Alma Lakin Holocaust Library and Resource Center. I ask you to consider becoming a member of our Berks History Center / Historical Society Museum and the Henry Janssen Library. Membership includes the museum, gift shop, an extensive research library, the Historical Review magazine, discounts on programs, trips, art, and craft workshops. And you can even learn to speak Pennsylvania Dutch, which is very similar to Yiddish. So you have two languages for the price of one. A big thank you to Michele Leisawitz, Stacy Seltzer, Sidney and Esther Bratt, and Amanda Hornberger from the Jewish Federation of Reading for making this possible. The planning of this program fell before the recent atrocities against Israel by the terrorist group Hamas and Israel declaring war on Gaza. As we gather today, what we're about to hear has even more significance. As I prepared for today, thoughts drifted to my father. I walked past a framed document hanging in my hallway. This document held a prominent position in his office and then mine. It remained there until my retirement when I transferred it to my home. It is from the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, dated 1980, expressing appreciation to the 89th Infantry Division for valiant services during the 1944-45 liberation by Allied forces of Nazi concentration camps. My father served under Patton's Third Army in the 89th Infantry Division as a scout and a sharpshooter as they fought through Rhineland and central Germany. One of the cities captured, Eisenach, is where Martin Luther lived, while another was Ohrdruf, the home of J.S. Bach. My father, along with the 89th, liberated the first concentration camp in Ohrdruf. At the end of the war, my father returned to his new bride, picking up the pieces emotionally and physically to start a new life. I say these words today in memory of him and the host of others who steadfastly fought for our freedom. President Ronald Reagan declared, "This conference serves as a stark reminder of what transpired and will strengthen our resolve to prevent mankind from sinking into that ultimate horror again." Harvey M. Meyerhoff, chairman of the Holocaust Memorial Council, is quoted, "We shall carry the message of remembrance to the next generation and to all the generations that follow, so that none shall forget." And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the COO of the Jewish Federation of Reading, Amanda Hornberger.
Thank you all for being here today. The Jewish Federation of Reading Berks is proud to continue to share the stories of our Holocaust survivors with the community. Now more than ever, it's important to hear their stories of survival, the compassion of those who helped, and the individual decisions that meant life or death to Jews during World War II. I want to thank the Berks History Center and Susan Weiser for reaching out to us to make this event possible. Thank you to the History Center for donating the proceeds from today's event to the Lakin Holocaust Library and Resource Center at Albright College. The Lakin Holocaust Library is a 30-year-old partnership between Albright College and the Jewish Federation of Reading, and it's home to 36 recorded survivor testimonies, including Sid and Esther Bratt's. Proceeds from today's program will go towards transcribing these testimonies to make them more accessible for students and scholars who want to learn the lessons from our survivors who moved to Berks County after the Holocaust. There's a quote from Elie Wiesel, which I think is very fitting given current events. Elie Wiesel said, and I quote, "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Your presence here today is a testament to your commitment to not being silent and to learning the stories of Sid and Esther. We hope that you take what you learned this afternoon and tell it to others. This shared educational outreach will be the lasting impact long after the last Holocaust survivor is here to share their story. Thank you to Michele and Stacy for being so willing to share your grandparents' stories. Your generation as the 3G is the living link between your grandparents' experience and the students of today and tomorrow. Thank you for sharing and for ensuring that we continue to never forget. Please join me in welcoming Michele and Stacy.
Thank you for inviting us here today. My name is Michele Leisawitz, and my sister Stacy Seltzer and I will be sharing my grandparents' story. My family and I live right nearby in Wyomissing. This is a photo of our beautiful grandmother, Esther Bratt. She and our grandfather, Sidney Bratt, are also local to this community, and they are both Holocaust survivors. And we're lucky that they're sitting in the front row here to listen to this story today. We are honored to be here today to share their stories. The person I'm about to tell you about is our Mama Esther, Gigi to her great-grandchildren. She was born on March 8, 1929. She is 94 years young. She and my grandfather have been married for over 70 years. They celebrated their 72nd wedding anniversary last April. She loves people. She's always optimistic. She loves to laugh. She's a friend to everyone. She is genuine and kind. She loves babies, especially her 4 grandchildren and 9 great-grandchildren. She tells the best jokes. Sometimes they aren't the cleanest jokes. And is a wonderful matriarch who amazes us with her memory and aptitude for language. Mama Esther and I have always been close, and I am so honored to be able to share her story. Here she is singing a Polish song to one of her great-grandchildren when he was a baby.
This is just for you. One for us. Who is that?
Unser schöniger, kleiniger
Now we're gonna go do
I
magic.
think a Beckala.
Yay!
If I told you that you had a 1.5% chance of making it to 15 years old, how would that change the way you think about your life? If you were fortunate enough to make it to 15, how would you treat your time afterwards? That was my grandmother's reality. She lives the motto, don't sweat the small stuff. 1.5%. This is the likelihood my grandmother had of surviving. To survive with her parents, she had less than a 1% chance. This means that if there were 100 families in a room, only one would survive. My grandmother's family was that one. The fact that I'm speaking to you today is nothing short of a miracle. The Holocaust, also known as the Shoah, was the intentional mass murder of European Jews as well as other minority groups during World War II between 1941 and 1945. Shoah is the Hebrew word for catastrophe. This term is specifically used to describe the killing of 6 million Jews in Europe by the Nazis and their collaborators. English-speaking countries more commonly use the word Holocaust, which is Greek for sacrifice by fire. Nazi Germany and its collaborators murdered 6 million Jews just because they were Jewish. Stories of survival are the exception and not the rule. 2 out of 3 European Jews died. On the left is a picture of my grandmother's mother's family. Her mother, my Nana Musha, is circled. She was one of 6 siblings. On the right is a picture of my grandfather's father's family. Her father, my Papa Mula, is circled. He is the youngest of 11 siblings. To show you the impact the war had on my family, I want to update the image to what it looked like after the war. Everyone with an X over their face did not survive. My grandmother is an only child. Her parents you just met, Nana Musha and Papa Mula, came from large families, as you saw. Papa Mula was a businessman. He worked in the lumber business and was successful. They lived in a beautiful apartment, and my grandmother was very proud. She even had her own room. Religion was never a big priority for her family, but they celebrated holidays and enjoyed traditions and being together. They spoke Russian, Yiddish, Polish in their home. My grandmother is 8 years old in this picture. Aside from creating the mental image, I am showing this picture because a winter coat similar to the one she had on here played an integral role in her survival story. As you can see, there are two maps pictured. The one on the left is Vilna today, and the one on the right is pre-war Vilna. The red star shows where Vilna is. Today, it is part of Lithuania. However, when my grandmother was born, it was part of Poland. Before the Holocaust, Vilna was a very Jewish city. It was known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. To give you an idea, there were 100,000 Jews living in Vilna, about a third of the city's total. There were 105 synagogues and prayer houses and 6 daily Jewish newspapers. My grandmother remembers there being a lot of Jewish culture. There were many school options, but her parents chose to put her in a Polish school for Jewish children. She went to school for 4 years until the 4th grade. Anti-Semitism was rampant. One example my grandmother shared happened to her with one of her friends. As an only child, she always loved playing with her friends. One of her neighbors wasn't Jewish, and she remembers they enjoyed playing together. One day, the girl invited her over, and when my grandmother went inside, her friend's grandfather angrily told her to leave. He was mad at his granddaughter for letting a Jewish girl into their home. My grandmother tells this story with tears in her eyes, but says, "You just got used to it." Because she went to a Polish school with other Jewish children, they went to school on Sunday. The non-Jewish children knew that these children were Jewish because of this, and would often wait for them on Sunday morning, throwing stones and calling them names as they walked to school. She remembers her mother finding stones in her coat pocket and asking what they were. She sadly admitted she felt she needed to put them there in case she had to protect herself. The German invasion of Vilna was very sudden. In fact, my grandmother remembers it was a beautiful June morning in 1941, and she was headed to her school for a picnic. From late 1939 until this point, Vilna had been under the control of the Soviet Union. My grandmother remembers life under the Soviets as being difficult, but nothing compared to the cruelty of the Nazis. My grandmother's family didn't live near the school since the Russian soldiers had forced them to move to a smaller apartment across town. She packed her picnic lunch, and when she got to school, the door was locked. The custodian told her that there was a war and she should go home. She ran to her girlfriend's house who lived near the school, and the girl's parents told her to run home. The Germans were bombing the city, and she remembers sirens going off. She kept running to shelter the whole way home. She was so scared and just wanted to get home to her parents. She had to go over a bridge because they lived on the other side of the river. By the time she got home, the bridge had been bombed. She made it over the bridge by minutes, maybe a half hour at most. She and her family went to shelters to be protected from the bombs, and within 2 days, Vilna was occupied by the Nazis. There was indescribable suffering under the Nazis. They didn't waste any time. Immediately, they had laws against the Jews. She remembers all their possessions had to be given away: gold, jewelry, even her new bicycle. Soldiers came into her home and started taking things. There were no repercussions. Anybody could rob a Jewish home, and they took pleasure in doing so. All Jews had to wear a Jewish star, like the one pictured, on the front and back of their garments. They were only allowed to walk in the gutters, not on the sidewalks. They couldn't go anywhere. Everything was closed to the Jews. And if they disobeyed, they were shot. Banks closed and money was of no value anymore. Friends who weren't Jewish were too scared to help. My grandmother remembers the Nazis putting up gallows in the main square. They hung a Polish man there with a big sign saying, "This man is hanging here because he helped Jews." Nazis would go into Jewish homes and take young boys or men and tell them they were going to work. They took them 5 to 6 miles outside of Vilna to a place called Pinari, which was an unfinished construction site, and shot them. Can you imagine how scared these people must have felt to know they were about to be shot? To watch those in front of them get shot, knowing they were next. My grandmother's cousin, Isha, was one of the first to be shot at Pinari. He was only 18 years old. Over the course of the war, approximately 100,000 people, mostly Jews, were shot at Pinari. In September of 1941, when my grandmother was 12 years old, the Nazis established the Vilna Ghetto. The Nazis took all of the people from Vilna and the surrounding areas and literally pushed them into a few streets in the Jewish quarter to create the ghetto. This area had been where the poorer Jews from Vilna had been living. They killed the poorer Jews and moved the rest of the Jews in. As you can see, in the darker gray and green, there is a larger ghetto and a smaller ghetto. Those that were brought to the larger ghetto were less unlucky, because most of the people brought to the smaller ghetto were killed within a few months. My grandmother's family was taken to the larger ghetto. The ghettos were surrounded by wires, barricades, and guards. Here is how my grandmother remembers it. She was looking out her window one September day, and she saw Jewish people from her neighborhood walking with bundles on their backs. Suddenly, Nazis arrived at her home and with guns, and told them they had 10 minutes to grab whatever they could carry. Her mother put a big blanket on the floor, and they took what they could. I have always questioned, what would I bring? What would you bring? They brought food, underwear. My grandmother even packed her favorite doll. She remembers it was a hot day, but her mother insisted she bring her coat, the one I spoke about earlier. This coat saved her life. She used it to keep warm, as a blanket, and even as a pillow. They left their house having no idea where they were going. The Nazis brought them to the ghetto. They were exhausted. Many families had been separated. People were so scared. She and her parents put their few possessions down in an empty store and slept on the floor there. There were people everywhere, thousands and thousands of people. The next day, when they woke up, they looked for a place to put their things and stay. They found a room that had been part of someone's apartment. They shared this room with 15 other people. There were 6 women who shared a double bed. The men slept on the floor. They did their best to stay clean, but there was very little food, necessities, or clothing. There was a shortage of everything, all the time. You just did without, is what she said. My grandmother, my Papa Mula, was randomly selected to work as a mechanic outside of the ghetto. Many of the men worked outside. He would sneak in food whenever he could. My Nana Musha even created a hiding place in his coat so he could smuggle food in for them. The picture on the right was taken in 1989 when my grandmother went back to visit Vilna. Here she is, the woman on the right, pictured in front of the building she and her family lived in the ghetto. Across from her is her cousin Hasha. who survived the war with the partisans. The partisans were fighters, often teenagers, who fought back against the Nazis. The majority were individuals who escaped the ghettos and work camps and joined organized resistance groups in the forest and urban underground. This is a photo of the Jewish quarter of Vilna before the war to give you an image of what it looked like. The Nazis were constantly trying to manage the population of the ghetto. They tried to do this in a way so the Jews wouldn't get scared. When my grandmother arrived in the ghetto, there were 40,000 people in there with her. Over her 2 years there, thousands of them were sent to Pinari to be killed. One of the most traumatic stories during her time in the ghetto had to do with a white shine. In German, the word shine means document. It's literally a piece of paper. This was used as an ID card. In November of 1941, only a few months after arriving in the ghetto, the Nazis decided to reduce the population. Every family received a shine, either a white one or a yellow one. My Papa Mula was handed a white shine. He didn't know what this meant. In the middle of the night, they announced that everyone had to come register at the front gate. Everyone with a white shine should stay in the ghetto, and those with yellow shines should leave and go to the place of work with their family. A family consisted of a husband, wife, and up to 3 kids. There was complete panic in the ghetto as people began to realize the white shines, like the one my grandmother's family had, likely meant death. In this clip, you will hear how my grandmother managed to escape in her own words.
So my father said to us, let's separate, because if we stick together, we have less of a chance. He says, I'll try to run away, you try to run away, we'll just see what we can do. Okay. And he left. We didn't know, my mother and I didn't know what happened to him. He just disappeared. And we decided to go back to our room in the ghetto, senseless. We didn't know, there were hiding places in the ghetto, but we weren't sure where exactly. And we decided, since we are already on the street, let's keep going towards the main gate. Maybe we'll somehow get out. And I remember my mother and I standing in the front of in the ghetto side, at the main gate, seeing all the people with the yellow shines leaving the ghetto, and there were guards at the door, at the gate, counting for 5 people, like usually mother, father, 3 children. It was getting towards the end, and we saw trucks and gun people with the Germans with the guns outside the ghetto. That they got, as soon as the people with the yellow shines leave, they will go in and kill take the people with the white shines on the trucks and take them to Pinari. And I remember telling my mom, we have no choice. Let's do something. This is the end. So she said, what are we going to do? And there we see a couple with a yellow shine going with 1 child. And we slightly knew them. And we said, we'll connect with you, maybe. And my mother says, at least you can say that I am their child. And she would, but I was holding on to Mom. And somehow, by some miracle, and I don't know how it happened, I didn't want to let go of my mother. And I'm sorry. And the guard counted 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just let us go. And we ended up on the other side of the ghetto. And we thought, well, now we are free. And we went with this man to his place of work. And we stayed there for the day.
They didn't know what had happened to her father. When they went back to the ghetto that night, it was eerily quiet. It was like a morgue. When they left, it had been total chaos, and now it was just silence. The people who had been hiding saw them return and began crawling out. Melina was the word for a hiding place. Everyone always had a Melina in their minds of where they would go, under beds, in closets, anywhere they could find. My grandmother and her mother returned to their apartment. People were hysterical, looking for relatives. Suddenly, out of nowhere, her father appeared. The relief she felt that they had all survived was so intense, but she says so was the sadness for all those lost that day. She later learned that about 6,000 people were killed at Pinari that day. Winters in Vilna were very cold. My grandmother's coat saved her on many of those extremely cold days. She lived in the ghetto from the age of 12 to 14. It was a horrible time. She was scared every hour of every day. In September of 1943, my grandmother and her parents were taken out of the Vilna ghetto. They traveled by bus for about a half hour and arrived at Hakapeh, a slave labor camp in Vilna. They arrived there with 1,200 other Jews from the ghetto. Relatively speaking, they were the lucky ones. Within days, the ghetto was liquidated and the majority of people were sent to Pinari to be killed. The purpose of the camp was to help the Germans reconstruct motors. Because my Papa Mula had randomly been selected to work as a mechanic while in the ghetto, he was chosen to work at Hakapeh. My grandmother shared a room with her parents and 2 other couples. She slept on a hard door. She was so thankful for her coat. It was the only soft thing she had to help her. The living conditions were similar to the ghetto, except they were further outside the city, so they could see some green space. My grandmother was 14 at this point. Her father would leave to work on motors. Her mother worked in the laundry room, and she worked as a seamstress, sewing socks for soldiers. They worked 6 days a week. Every Sunday morning, the prisoners had to stand outside for a roll call. One day, she remembers they brought in a family, a husband, wife, and their 4-year-old child. A gallows had been constructed in front of 2 big buildings. You can see them in this picture, the 2 buildings. Nobody knew why they were there. The Nazis announced that they had tried to run away, but they caught them in the city and brought them back. They took the family in front of everyone and said, "This is what happens when you run away." The Nazis took the 4-year-old girl by the neck, like you pick up a cat, and shot her in the head. Everybody was stunned. Her mother started screaming, and they shot her too. They then put a rope around the father's neck and hung him in front of everyone. This was done just to teach a lesson, not to run away. There were some children in the camp. In March of 1944, to try to bring some joy to everyone there, the children put on a play for the holiday of Purim. A few days later, a horrible thing happened in the camp. Kinder action, an action against the camp's children. The Germans decided to take away the majority of the 250 children living in the camp. What happened to my grandmother and to the children of Hakapeh was happening across Europe, as the Nazis took intentional action to kill the next generation of Jews. My grandmother remembers the gate opening and big black trucks pulling in between the buildings. German soldiers with guns were running around looking for children. They took them from wherever they were, even from their mother's arms, and pushed them into trucks. Everyone was screaming and crying. There was no reason why they took them other than that they weren't helping with the economy of the camp. A soldier came over to my grandmother with a revolver pointed to her head and went to push her in a truck. Her father, who happened to be next to her, had enough presence of mind to tell them she was a worker and not a child. My grandmother believes her height saved her life in this situation. She was tall for her age, and they let her go. If you looked young, they took you, no rhyme or reason. She remembers it was so awful, especially being that it was right after such a sweet and beautiful play that those kids had performed. Because her father worked outside, he had some contact with non-Jewish people. He worked with a Christian man named Nikolai. Nikolai liked my Papa Mula and told him if he could, he'd help him. In July of 1944, Papa Mula was at work when he heard that the Germans were losing the war and the Russians would be arriving in Vilna soon. He knew the first thing the Germans would do would be to kill as many Jews as they could. He ran to find my grandmother and Nana Masha and gave them directions to Nikolai's house. He told them there was a drunk guard at the gate and they must leave immediately. He would try to follow later. My grandmother and Nana Masha walked out of camp, and sure enough, there was only one guard and he was too drunk to notice. They immediately tore off their yellow stars and walked a couple of blocks to Nikolai's house. My grandmother remembers her mom telling her to smile as they walked to Nikolai's house. If you smile, they won't know we are Jewish. The Jewish people are sad. We must look happy. They arrived at Nikolai's house, and based on what Papa Mula had shared, they prayed they were at the right place. A man was sleeping on the porch. They woke him and told him who they were. He was scared and asked if anyone followed them. Each of them knew the risk he was taking helping them. If anyone found out that he had helped Jews, they would kill him and his family. My grandmother always remembers the Polish man who was hung for helping Jews early in the war. Nikolai led them to his small cellar. As darkness fell that night, the cellar door slammed open and Papa Mula arrived, white as a ghost and shaking. He told them that within an hour of their leaving the camp, the Germans sent in reinforcements. The Jews in the camp panicked and began running. The Nazis shot at them. He ran and survived. They huddled together and couldn't believe they had escaped. The Russians began a bombing offensive against the Germans as they tried to reclaim Vilna. Nikolai left to keep himself and his family safe. He left them with food and water. They lived in this tiny cellar for 2 weeks, praying the bombs would not hit the house. Nikolai arrived back from the country and told them that it was safe to come out. The Germans were gone. My grandmother was 15 years old. She remembers thinking throughout the war that her goal was to live to be a teenager, but she didn't believe she would survive. It was at this moment that she realized she would survive. Imagine surviving all of this and with your parents. Now what? The war didn't end until May of 1945, about a year later. They had no money, no job, nothing. What do you do next? My grandmother and her parents instinctively went back to Hakapeth. They learned that many people found Melinas and went into hiding, but they had the same hiding spot in mind. There wasn't enough oxygen in some of these hiding places, and many Jews died from suffocation. Others were found by the Nazis, and shallow graves were barely covered when my grandmother and her parents arrived back at the camp. Over the next few months, Papa Mula managed to get a job, and my grandmother enrolled in a Russian school. It was very hard for her and her family, but they were also so thankful to be alive and free. The war ended in May of 1945, but there was still a lot of anti-Semitism, and she and her parents were still reeling from what they had experienced. Over the next year, they traveled to multiple displaced persons camps, or DP camps, looking for relatives and figuring out where to go. Vilna felt like a cemetery, and there were too many bad memories there. Through these travels, they ended up spending 9 months at a DP camp in Austria. She has positive memories of this time as people looked forward to starting new lives. Here are some photos of her in Austria in 1946. By now, she was 17 years old. While in the DP camp, her family met a chaplain who offered to try and connect them with relatives in America. Her mother wrote to her brother, Michael Gordon, in New York City. They didn't have an address, just his name, and somehow he received the note. To this day, we don't know how her note got to the right Michael Gordon in New York City, but it did. He sent for them, and they traveled by boat to the States. It took them about 2 weeks. They arrived in New York City on the Marine Flasher, June 18, 1946, over 77 years ago. They were the third ship with displaced persons to arrive in the United States. Everyone on the boat was crying at the sight of the Statue of Liberty and the idea of living in a free country. She remembers this being incredibly emotional. I often think back to my grandmother's story and am amazed to realize that our family was the 1 in 100. It really is incomprehensible. Why our family? I've always felt proud to be a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, and I am in awe of my grandmother's strength and positivity. I'm honored to be able to share her story with you today.
My name is Stacy Seltzer. It is an honor to be here today talking with you about our grandfather, our pop-up Sid. Oftentimes, when people hear that our grandparents survived the Holocaust, their first question is, which concentration camp were they in? It is an understandable question. However, what is often unrealized is that not every survivor went through a concentration camp. As you just heard, our grandmother survived the unthinkable, but she was never in a concentration camp. Similarly, our grandfather had a very different experience during the Holocaust, one which is important to both learn and understand. His experience didn't involve a concentration camp either. Pop-up Sid was born on August 22nd, 1928. He just turned 95 years old. He hasn't had an easy life, but he is one of the smartest, most determined people I know. He is an amazing photographer, a hardworking businessman, a passionate gardener, and just a true gentleman. He is also a loving father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. He and I have always been close, and I am so honored to be able to share his story with you. Here is a video of him singing with 2 of his great-grandchildren a few years ago.
If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands.
Yep, clap.
If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands.
Clap, clap.
If you're happy and you know it and you really want to show it. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands.
Clap.
I'd like you to close your eyes. Imagine you are standing on the platform of a train with a small suitcase. The suitcase has some clothes, a prayer book, and a few pictures. You know you are going to a new country, a place where you don't know the language. You don't know anybody. You are alone. Now imagine doing this, and you are only 9 years old. This was my grandfather. His mother told him, "You lead the way and we'll follow you. We'll see you in England." I am going to share with you his story of courage and bravery as he left everything he knew to move to a new country and learn a new language alone at the age of 9. The picture on the screen is of my grandfather's family. He is the one circled in red. His mother, Elsa, is on the left. They had a very close relationship. His twin brothers, Heinz and Irvin, are in the center, and his little sister, who is only 1 year younger, they were a year younger, and in the middle is his little sister, Irma. His grandmother, Bertha, is in the very back next to his father, Papa Alfred. My grandfather was very close with his siblings, since they were all so close in age. On the map, you can see Germany towards the bottom middle of the screen. Many of you may know Warsaw. This is on the right side of the map. Warsaw wasn't far from where my grandfather lived. The red star on the screen shows Gustav, which is a town where my grandfather was born. It was a small town. Today it is part of Poland, and it is called Dobre Miasto. When my grandfather was growing up there, it was called Gutstadt and was part of Germany. It is located in the very eastern part of Europe, near Vilna, where our grandmother was born. My grandfather was born in the same house as his father in the same town. It is the yellow house on the right of the screen. On the left is a huge stork nest at the top of the tower that my grandfather remembers, which is still there today. There were about 7,000 people living in the town. 25 to 40 of them were Jewish, only about 1 to 2% of the town. Jews and non-Jews got along well, and my grandfather remembers his father being like the mayor of the town. Everyone seemed to know him. There were 2 rivers going through the town, and my grandfather remembers boating, fishing, and swimming. They had hot summers and cold winters, and he remembers ice skating to school and even skiing. The town he lived in was a small agricultural town. He went to the same elementary school as his father. It was almost like a one-room schoolhouse. There were 3 classes conducted in one room. They had one synagogue, which he remembers being big and beautiful. His family was at the synagogue often for services and religious school. Similar to our grandmother, our grandfather also experienced anti-Semitism as a child. One example of anti-Semitism happened when my grandfather was in school. One of his teachers began treating all of the Jewish children differently than the non-Jewish children. My grandfather felt terrible. This wasn't fair. But other than that, he had a lot of non-Jewish friends and a very nice childhood. In 1937, he remembers things started to change. Restrictions were being put in place. The Jews weren't allowed to have bicycles. They could only walk in the gutter and not on the sidewalk. Nazi soldiers, also known as the SS, began appearing in their town. Jewish people were told they could no longer shop in certain stores, and his non-Jewish friends and their parents stopped speaking to his family. In fact, he remembers they would spit at him, hit him, and throw rocks at him when he walked by. It was horrible. My grandfather remembers listening to Hitler's speeches on the radio. He would listen to his father and the other Jewish men. They talked about leaving Germany, but they felt secure that it would be okay. Many of them had fought for Germany in World War I, so why would people not see them as fellow German citizens? Does anybody know the date November 9th of 1938?
Yeah, you put it up.
This was a night that my grandfather will never forget, a night that changed his life. Kristallnacht, the night of shattered glass. This term, Kristallnacht, has been used to describe that night due to the shattering of glass from Jewish stores and synagogues. However, in more recent years, it has also been called Pogromnacht. A pogrom is a violent riot incited with the aim of massacring or expelling an ethnic or religious group, particularly the Jews. By calling this night Pogromnacht, it references that there was more than just broken glass that night. There were Nazis raiding Jewish homes, terrorizing and arresting the Jewish people just because they were Jewish. The Jewish people have been plagued by pogroms for most of our existence, and this was another instance. My grandfather's family lives near the synagogue. In fact, they could see it from their home. A night that I've read out in history books, he actually lived. The picture on the left is a child reading from the Torah at my grandfather's synagogue. This was a holy space that my grandfather enjoyed going to, and he felt connected to. The photo on the right is an image seen during this night. Can you imagine the fear they must have felt watching this happen? In this clip, you can hear my grandfather describe the horror he experienced during the night.
Start to see traces of change in 1937, I believe it was. But the major change came on the 9th of November 1938. That is Kristallnacht. We lived on a street very close to where the synagogue was. And one night we heard a lot of racket that's going on. And we went to the window to look, and we saw the flames shooting up. And then we suddenly realized that's from the synagogue. And as we looked closer, we could see that not only did they have the synagogue was burning, but also there was a bonfire on the street in front of the synagogue. We noticed that people were throwing things out of the synagogue onto the bonfire, and it seemed like everybody was really having a lot of fun there. So we were really scared because we had an inkling of what might be going on. We saw the SS and the SA and the people. They were starting to treat the Jews more and more like dirt, because we heard Hitler's speeches on the radio, and we were starting to feel very uncomfortable. And the men, when they were playing, the Jewish men, they would be talking. I heard them talking that it's time to leave Germany and to go to South America, go England, go anywhere. So we had suspicions that, that this was definitely set the fire there. Then, after a little while, we heard a knocking on the door.
The same night.
This was within maybe an hour or so after we saw the fire. They came and knocking on the door, and then the SS broke in and said that they wanted my father. So they grabbed a hold of my father and they took him away. And we asked, where are you going? Was it one? You'll find out. They wouldn't give us any other answer.
My father's mother, who was alone now since her husband had just been arrested, found out there was a Jewish organization called Kinder Transport, which took children to England. Kinder means child, and this was literally a transport for children. She applied to get immigration papers and exit visas for her family, but was told she could only send one child. What do? You have 4 children. You are a single mom. Your husband is wrongfully in prison. You are able to send one child to what you hope will be safety. My grandfather's mother chose my grandfather. The twins couldn't be separated, and his little sister Irma was too young. At 9 years old, my grandfather was told he'd be leaving his family and everything he knew and going alone to a new country. My grandfather remembers packing a small suitcase. He was told not to bring a lot. He remembers all the women and children in his family. The men were all in jail. They came to the train station with him that June morning. He got on the train. His mother kept saying, "You lead the way, we'll follow you. We'll see you in England." He went on reluctantly. He didn't want to leave. He'll never forget them waving to him. He didn't know it at the time, but this would be the very last time he saw them. Looking back, he thinks his mother knew that they would never see each other again, but he believed her words, and she stayed strong for him. She knew that he wouldn't get on that train if he realized it meant leaving his family forever. He had never really left Goodstop before now. The train brought him to Berlin. His mother's sisters were waiting for him. They brought him to their homes, and he slept over before heading to Hamburg to take the SS Washington ship to England. It took them 5 days to get to England. He remembers there being a few hundred children on the boat. He didn't know anybody. They gave him a tag with his name and the information since he didn't speak English. I'm going to pause here to share a little bit more about Kinder Transport. After Kristallnacht, the British government agreed to allow children under the age of 17 to enter Great Britain from Germany. Private citizens or organizations had to guarantee payment for each child's care, education, and eventual emigration from Britain. In return, the British government agreed to allow unaccompanied refugee children to enter the country on temporary travel visas. It was understood at the time that when the crisis was over, the children would return to their families. Parents or guardians were not allowed to accompany their children. My grandfather arrived in England and remembers being so traumatized. He couldn't speak the language, he didn't know anybody, and he didn't know where he was going, and he missed his family. He remembers many of the kids were crying. They were young. There were so many children, many under the age of 5, and not many older than 12. He was taken to a big camp called the Barham House in Ipswich. There were over 3,000 boys there. He went to school, he was given clothing and food, and he was treated well. But he was lonely and he was scared, and he missed his family. My grandfather lived at the Barham House for about a year. During this time, my grandfather received letters from his father and learned that his father had been able to get a visa and leave Germany as well. He was being held at a camp called Kitchener with about 3,000 other male Jewish refugees. This was a refugee camp, not a concentration or death camp. He was then held as a prisoner of war on the Isle of Man, an island between England and Ireland. The English allowed these men into the country, but treated them as spies, since they didn't know who could be trusted during this time. His father was in this camp helping English war efforts as a bricklayer for several years. I recently learned more about this camp. In the immediate aftermath of November 1938, the Central British Fund for German Jewry, CBF, now the World Jewish Relief, managed to persuade the British government to allow the CBF to mount rescues of groups of Jews from Greater Germany. The first of these rescues, of 10,000 unaccompanied children, is what my grandfather was a part of, the Kindertransport. However, there was also a second rescue. This was much less known. This was what my great-grandfather Alfred was a part of. 4,000 adult men, many of whom had been arrested during November 1938, like my great-grandfather, were transported by train to an old First World War base known as Kitchener Camp. The CBF was responsible for transporting, creating accommodations, and supporting both of these groups financially. The British Home Office gave permission for these rescues to take place on the condition that neither group would make Britain their permanent home. The photo on the right is some of the boys at Barham House. On the left is a photo of some younger children on the Kindertransport. During this time, my grandfather received letters from his mother through the Red Cross. He learned that she and his siblings had traveled to Holland trying to get to England, but the war started and they never made it out. He remembers writing to his mother and asking why. Why did you send me away and keep everyone else together? He felt so alone. On the screen, you can see some of the letters he received from his mother. We had them translate them from German to English. He saved every single letter. Some were postcards that didn't give much information because nobody knew who was reading them. However, the letter on the right explains what his mother was going through. You can see she writes, "Now I don't know what is going to happen to me." Can you imagine the fear she had trying to protect herself and 3 children while worrying about her husband, who she hadn't heard from, and a child she had sent away? My grandfather clung to these letters, but one day they just stopped. In May of 1940, at the age of 11, he was moved to a new place to live. The Kindertransport organization, which was run by Jewish agencies, tried to divide the kids into smaller groupings for 2 reasons. First, they wanted them all to be able to live in places that were able to get to know them and spend more time with them as individuals. And they were also worried about disease and not having so many children all in one space. When asked, my grandfather told them he loved Judaism and he wanted to move to Palestine, which is now Israel. Israel was not a country yet, but my grandfather dreamed of moving to a Jewish country one day, a place where he and his family could be free to live without being targeted for their religion. He went by train about 20 miles northeast of London, near the coast, to a place called the Clayton Farmhouse. He remembers it was a huge house and there were about 30 boys living there with him. Mr. and Mrs. Bear ran the house. They were religious Hebrew teachers. My grandfather remembers going to school and having a lot of Hebrew and Jewish education. He loved it there and was very close with Mr. and Mrs. Bear. In August of 1941, he was able to have his bar mitzvah. He was so proud and excited. Studying and living in this environment, he understood the importance of becoming a bar mitzvah. Mrs. Bear even made him a tallis bag that he still uses. A bar mitzvah is a celebration of a Jewish child becoming a Jewish adult at the age of 12 for girls and 13 for boys. It is a wonderful celebration welcoming a child into the Jewish faith as an adult. A talis, or talit, is a prayer shawl that is worn during prayers to create a sense of personal space by wrapping oneself in it. It looks a little like a blanket and is worn over the shoulders. At this point, my grandfather's father had been released as a prisoner of war and was living in England. He came to visit my grandfather and be there for his bar mitzvah ceremony. You would think this would be joyful and an amazing reunion, but my grandfather says it wasn't. His father had changed, he'd aged, he'd been through so much. They barely spoke, and after 3 years apart, they didn't know how to reconnect with one another. It's hard to imagine the joy of being reunited with your father, being so tarnished by the war and everything that they had been through. It pains me that they were not able to be close after losing so much. He lived in this home with the Bear family for 3 years. In May of 1943, my grandfather was now 14 years old. His dream of moving to a Jewish country was still there, and so the Kinder Transport transferred him to a place called the Polton House in Edinburgh, Scotland. Every time he moved, he remembers worrying about how his mother would find him. He dreamt of being reunited with his family, even though he hadn't heard from his mother or siblings for several years now. The Polton House was a very large physical facility, and he lived there with about 40 other teenagers. They spent their days working in the gardens and helping with the war effort. He would often go and help other farmers whose husbands had been drafted into the army. It wasn't easy work, but he enjoyed his time there. As a side note, after settling into the United States, he always had the most beautiful garden. This was a skill he learned and really enjoyed. I have such positive memories of him gardening and us playing in his backyard on Lorraine Road when I was little. He lived in the Polton House until 1945. They moved out just as the war was ending. At this time, my grandfather moved to England to be near his father, who was now living and working there. He took any job he could find. He went to night school and he trained to be a mechanic. During their time in England, they tried to connect with any family that had survived. They went through hundreds of lists that were posted, but couldn't find anything about them. My great-grandfather wanted to move to America. He had met another survivor and remarried, and she had family in the States. He asked my grandfather to join them. Although the relationship was still strained, they only had each other. My grandfather still had dreams of moving to a Jewish country, but he agreed to move to the United States first. He moved to the United States in October of 1948. Israel had just been established in May of 1948. They came to the US by boat and landed in New York City. My grandfather was 20 years old, and you can see his passport on the screen. His first 6 months in the US were very hard. He had no friends, and he struggled to find work, but he worked incredibly hard and began building a life. After he met my grandmother, they decided to stay here. My grandfather built a successful business and had 3 beautiful daughters. He also got involved in local politics. He felt it was important to make his voice heard and stay connected because he saw what could happen when the wrong people were in power. To this day, we don't know what happened to his mother or siblings. I often think about my great-grandmother's courage to send my grandfather to England during the war. Throughout his life, my grandfather worked incredibly hard and built a successful business and a beautiful family. There will always be a sadness within him for all that he lost, and at such a young age. But I have no doubt that his mother would be so proud of the life he has lived and the family he has created. Thank you for listening to our grandfather's story. I hope you can share the story, and I hope that you can walk away recognizing that pain is not always physical. My grandfather didn't go through a concentration camp or a labor camp, but he suffered unimaginable emotional and mental anguish, being separated from his family at such a young age and not knowing what happened to them. Imagine the isolation of being sent away, questioning why you were picked to live and not your siblings, and the pain of not knowing what happened to your family. On top of that, the war affected his relationship with his father. Although they were the only survivors from their immediate family, their relationship was greatly impacted by the war, and they were never able to reconnect and get close to each other in the same way again. Our grandparents met in the Catskills at a Zionist convention, a convention for people who support Israel and a Jewish state. They were married in New York City 6 months later. Many survivors married quickly after the war, thankful to have love and family again after losing so much. Here are 2 pictures of our grandparents on their wedding day. You can see how young and happy they were. Our grandparents had 3 daughters. My mom, Evelyn, is their oldest daughter. We wanted to share photos of some special items that our grandparents still have from before, during, and right after the war. The top left photo is of a Siddur, a Jewish prayer book that our grandfather's mother gifted him before he left for England. It is falling apart at the seams, but he still uses it, and it's just such a beloved part of our family. You can see his English and Hebrew name on the title page. The top middle photo is of a ring. This ring was made for our grandmother by a Jewish jeweler in the Vilna ghetto. She doesn't know how he got the silver or tools to make the ring, but she remembers seeing her friends getting a ring, and she was excited to get one as well. On the front is our grandmother's initials. It says EI, Esther Israeli. And on the back was supposed to be the date of when they went into the ghetto, September of 1941. However, the jeweler mistakenly wrote September of 1942 on her ring. And next to September 1942, he left a space so that they would be able to write the date for when they were freed from the ghetto. Our grandmother remembers that most people that had rings put the Vilna ghetto logo on the front, but she chose her initials because she was afraid if she was ever able to escape and got caught, they would know she was Jewish and they would know she was from the Vilna ghetto. The top right photo is of the very first pair of shoes our grandmother received after the war ended. She had wooden shoes that she broke when she was escaping from Hakapeh, so she was barefoot. When her family was liberated by the Russians, she was able to enroll in school. Her parents didn't want her to have to go to school barefoot, so her father asked a shoemaker to make her these shoes. He used his first paycheck to pay for them, and she was so excited that she saved them for all these years. The bottom left photo is of a pin our grandmother purchased in Pakistan while she was in the DP camp. She was so excited for her very first piece of jewelry after the war, she saved it to always remember. And the last photo of the comb is a comb that Jewish workers made for our grandmother and her mother while they were in the Hakapeh labor camp. The workers found leftover metal and were excited to be able to make these for some of the women since they didn't have any beauty products. This was a really exciting thing to have, a comb. As you can see, our family has grown over the years. My mom's youngest sister, Lisa, passed away tragically in 2011. In the Jewish tradition, we often name our children using the first letter of the name of someone who passed away. Many of the family members pictured here on the screen were named after deceased family members. We want our children to know their history and to honor our loved ones. The pictures on the screen are of our family today. On the left is Esther and Sid with all their great-grandchildren, and on the right is our entire family. We all live close by and are very close with each other. There is no way around it. Hatred can be scary. This often takes root when we let fear take over. Fear can cause us to behave irrationally, and fear of another group of people can cause us to treat people without the basic human dignity we deserve. May we all work together to share these stories, to remember lives lost, and to treat others with kindness and respect so that nothing like this can happen again. I want to end with a quick slide. Thank you. I want to end with a quick slide on 3G Philly, a group for the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. As the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, often referred to as 3Gs, since we are the 3rd generation, we are tasked with the important job of making sure our grandparents' stories are not forgotten. As we share these stories, we do so with the goal of honoring our families while also educating our communities about the dangers of hatred in any form, including anti-Semitism, which is sadly rampant still today all across the world. We speak in classrooms, organize programs, and strive to make an impact on our communities. There are 3G groups around the world, and we work together with this shared goal. Please visit our webpage. There's some flyers to the back and business cards, 3gphilly.org, to learn more about our work. We are a nonprofit relying fully on donations and support from our community so we can run programs and voluntarily speak, sharing these important stories. And Sidney Silverman is also here from 3G Philly. Thank you again to Berks History Center for inviting us here today. And thank you to our amazing grandparents for giving us the platform to share their stories.